I did.
Mental health seminars. Rochelle is a lecturer at the UCL, University College London Global Health Institute, and we keep meeting each other at meetings, and so we should do more. And I'm sorry you're making these connections, but it's really great to have you here. Rochelle has done a huge amount of work in community and empowerment-based interventions at the intersections between mental health and socioeconomic and other forms of deprivation and exclusion. So, really interested to hear your talk about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I guess hello to live streamers. I don't know what they can see. It's basically my waist.
No one yet.
Oh, okay. It's a bit weird. It's a block organization of my chest. Yeah, it really is a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about a project that has meant so much to me to be a part of, and some of the really exciting findings that have come out of this pilot. So as Crick said, I have been working for a while, sort of thinking about the links between community development, community empowerment, and mental well-being. I'm a community health psychologist by training, and what that sort of means is that I'm basically obsessed with social movements, social mobilization, and the way in which people take ownership to change their own lives and own settings. And I've worked in South Africa on topics related to this for long-ish time, about 10 years or so, 12 years. I was just saying to Catherine that I met her in Tate and had not remembered that I'd met her until I just Googled my Gmail and found my email. And so I've been working with community mobilization, as I said, and participatory methods and community engagement, but what I'm really going to talk about here is sort of a partnership that I have developed with a grassroots mental health NGO in Johannesburg named COURRAGE. I don't know if people are familiar with that organization, but it's led by a woman named Marcelo, and she has done a lot of work trying to use collective narrative therapy as an intervention modality to try and work with women who experience poverty and various forms of marginalization. And in this partnership, we wanted to do two things. We wanted to evaluate this program that she's been running for a while and hasn't completed any formal evaluation of. We also wanted to look a little bit at sort of what happens if, we give women an opportunity to build on the sort of individual empowerment that starts to grow once they participate in mental health intervention. So what happens if we create a space within an intervention setting that is supported and protected for women to put new aspirations into practice? And is this something that's feasible? Is this something that has any added benefits to the impact you might see just from a sort of psychological intervention? And if so, what are the next steps and what can we do about it? And this very much comes from my background in trying to really think about how we can bridge gaps between the work we do psychologically to promote well-being and social development side. And so there's quite clear referral pathways that might exist in South Africa, in particular, for example, to get a referral to social welfare department or social work, and how do you can you do something within the health system and within an intervention that also begins to think about structures and socio-structural reality in practical ways. So this, my thinking around this over the past few years has really sort of coalesced sort of around three key points. So trying to think about when we acknowledge social determinants and we acknowledge the impact of poverty, how do we think about that in a way that allows us to think about big determinants? So not just the individual experiences of poverty, but the way these individual experiences are very much connected to sort of political economies. And so what might a political economy of mental health look like? Burns, just Jonathan, I think, from UKZN has written a really nice piece in 2015, sort of mapping out what, or suggesting what a community or a political economy of mental health might look like, particularly around inequality, and sort of saying that it sort of draws quite heavily on your work, Rick, and trying to look at the different parameters that might need to inform a political economy of depression to get at this chronicity. And he highlights that we really need to think about this historically and politically. So how do big political systems have a history of oppression that is still sometimes very ever present for people in their everyday lives, still manifest and contribute to making sort of depression in ongoing cycles of depression. The second sort of angle to my work around this is sort of thinking about this idea of social intervention. Myself, Crick, and others, sort of at the end of last year, wrote a comment in that psychiatry trying to say that we needed sort of new paradigms to think about interventions that were more social in nature and building on the really good work that we've seen around socio-relational interventions. So interpersonal therapy, problem-solving therapy, friendship beds, these are very powerful interventions that look at look at promoting positive relationships, reducing isolation, contributing to psychosocial relationship or relational dynamics. But what we sort of identified as missing was a piece where we can begin to think practically about socio-structural interventions and looking at that across many levels and scales. So what I'm talking about today is at the level of an intervention on the level of population social interventions, things around reducing poverty, large scale, but thinking more in the intervention space. How do we create opportunities for recognizing this ongoing structural alignment and recognizing that this depression and chronicity of trauma is very much related to people's everyday experiences of structural violence, and sort of what might interventions look like that are a good fit for this. So we know that WHO guidelines for psychological and psychosocial interventions about for dealing in context of adversity, sorry, are very much sort of suggesting the importance of self-help plus and self-help interventions. And there was a recent trial published in Mental Global Health by sort of a group of actors who piloted self-help plus in post-conflict settings in Uganda. I'm not sure if anybody in this room has participated with that. Yeah, but you know, I can't remember his name. I can never pronounce his name. So yes, yeah, I'm not going to try. So, and really trying to think about sort of moving beyond sort of these ideas of self-help in contexts where you might have what Gilbert has talked about in terms of sort of social defeat and these ideas around how sort of individual cognitive framings and positions are sort of can be sometimes a very naturalistic response to coping, so the ways in which sort of over time the continued inability to imagine success leads you to behave in different ways and think different ways about possibilities that are open and available to you. And so how does this particular type of positioning interact with sort of these bigger, wider structural issues? So a lot of the work in sort of psychological fields, Gilbert and others have looked at this on an individual level, and more recently, Kujala and others from Latin America started to map this out, looking at sort of levels of the collective, and tried to say, okay, well, how can we think about the ways in which these big structural realities lock people into hopelessness, and are these then the paradigms and the mechanisms that we should be thinking about unlocking to move people into hope? And so for me, what we were trying to do is trying to see if interventions, the level of the intervention, community participatory engagement type of interventions are a place for this to happen. So I'll talk a little bit about the intervention. We called it Courage Plus because it's made of two parts. So the first part is a narrative counseling intervention, as I said, developed by Paula and Marcelo and her team, and it's rooted in sort of a collective narrative therapy approach. I don't know if anybody in the room is familiar with these modalities of therapy, but it is rooted in a recognition of strengths. And so you engage with trauma in a way that's slightly different to paradigms like narrative exposure therapy from a strengths-based position. So the idea of shifting the way in which you talk about your trauma to a recognition of your survival of your trauma. And so if you talk about it as something you've survived, and then unpacking the tools which help you to survive that. So very stepwise approach to shifting people from thinking about things from a cognitive framing that is around defeat and helplessness to one that is about hope and a sort of positive reframing of self. And at the heart of this particular type of approach is an interest in social justice and really sort of recognizing the way in which your trauma is connected back to these wider structures of society that people live in and live through. And hopefully through sort of the retelling of stories and the representation of self, you start to change how you think about yourself, how you value yourself, and sort of start to do more internalized acceptance of strengths and successes. And the plus session is they're sort of thought of as booster sessions, and so how do we again sort of create a space to think about and action responses to these structural challenges that are named. So we know quite well that when you ask women to talk about sort of cognitive interviews about what causes these symptoms of depression or anxiety, they talk about their lived reality, so their inability to feed their children, their inability to have reliable income. They talk about the structural things, and so this idea of the plus is, well, creating a space that gives them the chance to work on some of those structural things in a way that's supported through building networks, and also can sort of build on some of the empowerment that we see sort of developing at an individual level once people start to think differently about those things. And so Nyla Kabir's work in international development talks about empowerment and agency as this process where you sort of move forwards and backwards through sort of feeling empowered as an individual, and then maybe moving outwards towards collective action and sort of readiness for action. So this session, this package of sessions, is really about supporting readiness. So now that you feel better about yourself, you have hope. What are the things that you might put into practice to put that hope into reality? And so it's really drawing on tenets from community development and also entrepreneurship practices. So we use sort of stories about different women coming together in their community, and these stories are co-created by some of our facilitator team, which was made up of COLA staff and also auxiliary social workers from our project secretary. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And in addition to sort of an opportunity to plan the steps of the Canvas model, where you identify what you'd like to do, what you'll need to achieve it, who needs to be responsible for what different resources you need access to quite a tangible map of steps and resources. The women were given an opportunity to think about who they might like to speak to about training. So if you could talk to anybody to help put this into reality, who might that be? And the facilitators can identify a range of people that invite them to come and give a talk or training in order to support them. And so that's a very much sort of self-led, self-defined curriculum. And as I talk about some of the groups, they all sort of picked, they had one type of training that was the same across all of them, which was savings and sort of small group savings, which was save act, and they do lots of work in merits work at KZN, and are now recently moving to Gauteng. And another group had talks from the South African Federation of Mental Health around developing a creche for their children who are living with intellectual disability or disability. So this is what the intervention looked like. It ran for 13 weeks, and our implementation partners were POLA and the organization called Africa, and they do work around sort of promoting child well-being and development. And they had been working with a group of mothers of children with disabilities, and really were finding that the women were locked in sort of cycles of hopelessness and distress, and so they wanted to do something for these mothers. And so we came together to sort of extend this intervention to them as an opportunity to think about themselves for a change. Some of that comes out in interview dates that I'll show. And so we sort of start off with the main COURRAGE intervention. And so COURRAGE is an acronym, hence the double R, not just my dyspraxia / awful spelling. So in your first session is an intro, which is opening, ground rules, introducing researchers to the team and some of the sites where we did participant ethnography. And then these sessions are the core COURRAGE intervention, the collective narrative therapy. That's strength-based and arts-based, so the women create booklets or diaries around telling their story. And so they have a tangible book that they take home and keep and show to families and friends once the intervention's been completed. And so very much about this, starting from the beginning is a celebration of survival, and then mapping survival to the skills and pre-existing knowledge that people might have, where it came from, so thinking about family and history and culture, and thinking about how those can be positive aspects for people to anchor to. Then the reframing and an active focus in week 6 on reframing and repositioning themselves. So how would you describe yourself differently now that we have talked about all of your hardships and your survival and where your skills come from? And then sort of thinking collectively, so for the people that are important in their lives, how do we support them? How do we protect that? And then last step is envisioning the future. So ending on a positive note where people sort of develop hopes and dreams and aspirations. So a lot of the women quite low education levels, so a lot of them talk about getting them a trip, for example. And then the plus sessions come in to try and take those dreams and make plans for action. So if you have a plan to open an NGO, as one of the groups did, what are the steps that you need to take in order to do that? Who do you need to talk to about training? What sort of skills do you need? What resources do you need? And then how we work collectively if your dream is a collective one, if your aspiration is collective. And if it's individual, how will you support each other? So always trying to take this idea of community, engagement and cohesion along sort of the lifetime of the intervention, because they built obviously quite strong, meaningful relationships with each other in the first 8 or first 9 weeks. And then the final session is one that is sharing their plans. So they make posters of their plan and actually last week in Johannesburg, because it was our first big cohort, we had the graduation ceremony for all 50 women, which was really powerful and beautiful. And now I think we're just going to do that all the time, just talk about graduation, because why not? And we did 13 weeks learning about yourself, about what you'd like to do differently, making a plan to start your life over. Of course, you should wear a gown and a hat. I would like to. Every time I had a significant thing happen to me, I would love to have a moment to just pause and say, great, rather than, okay, great, I won a grant, now how on earth am I going to make that happen? So what's the thing? So a little bit about the sample. So we had 47 women participate in the pilot. They're primarily mothers of children with living with disability, who and their children are being supported by Africa Cocoon. And so we had these women distributed across 4 different sites of the NGO, in Alex Township, Orange Farm, Katanga, and Deep Sea. The average age of the women was 37. All of the women had histories of trauma, so conflict trauma relating to either experiences of IPV or sexual violence. And so in order to evaluate it, we decided to do this in sort of a 3-part process. So we wanted to, because I was working with the grassroots organization, and I know how important it is to be able to say to funders, here are some numbers about how well this works. I did something that I don't usually do, and so I'll have to beg your forgiveness as I start to talk about numbers shortly. Numbers are not my thing, stories are my thing, as these 2 parts show. So, but we wanted to look at impact of change in symptoms of depression, as measured by the PHQ-9, which is commonly used in primary healthcare settings all over the world, particularly in South Africa. We measured them at 3 time points, so the baseline, after the COURRAGE session, so just the first 9 sessions, the original COURRAGE practice, and again after the plus session to see if there's any boosted impact of having those additional supports. And then we had sort of ethnographic types of observations to look at sort of the process of the intervention, in addition to the facilitator exit interviews. We had participant observations of sessions, which were done at 2 of our sites, so Deep Sleep and Thunder. And then in the participatory, and in the Alex and the Orange Farm sites at the end of the intervention, the women were visited by an artist who worked with them to sort of develop what they felt was a theory of change for the time in the intervention. And then finally, sort of 28 interviews with women at all of the sites, so 7 women per site, where we did a life history interview combined with sort of your typical exit interview from an intervention, asking about how they felt at grant, what they might change, what they would keep the same, so on and so forth. And so trying to anchor that to discussions about their own histories and experiences. In addition, we will probably be analyzing the books that women themselves created to get another idea of sort of narrative journeys and narrative experiences through an additional another way to think about the process and also impact quality. So again, I beg your forgiveness. So myself, with the immense support of my research student at UCL, Nicholas, tried to look at sort of the PHQ outcomes for women in the intervention. So a total of 36 women completed all 3 data points. And so that is the bit of the sample that we used to do the ANOVA model. And we found a highly significant reduction from the baseline to the end of COURRAGE using this model of at 0.001 p-value, so reduction almost 9 points. And then the booster session saw an additional significant reduction of more than 2.5 points in PHQ. We also tried to look at where we had a slightly larger sample. So We did a t-test, which is from baseline to post-COURRAGE, and found that there was a reduction of a slightly less reduction, but still highly significant around at p.00. And just sort of, I work better with bar charts, so I have to do bar charts, so make more sense there. But trying to sort of look at that stepwise reduction. And I think one of the biggest surprises, which I was happy to sort of tell the women at our closing ceremony, but also wanted to keep it in here, was that of our sample of 36, 24 women dropped to 0. So we had women with no symptoms at the end of the plus session, which we thought was pretty special and pretty powerful. And in trying to sort of understand why, I think goes back to how an intervention like COURRAGE helps to shift cognitive framing, but also gives you a chance to practice and build on your empowerment in a supportive way. So you really feel like there might be some traction to change things. And so it will be interesting to look at sort of in about 6 months' time when we go to talk to some of these women again, looking at what their PhD manuscripts are, looking at what their projects, their planned projects, and how they've sort of come to pass over time. And so we wanted to look a little bit at sort of how those reductions happen. And so the biggest 4 points, biggest bit of the sample experienced a reduction between 6 and 10 points. There were 2 participants who had no reduction. One had no reduction, one had a slightly higher depression score. And because we are in such a nice small pilot, we're able to sort of look at each individual case, and those 2 women were women who, one woman had lost her son during the process of the intervention, and another woman was sort of locked in a very violent, problematic partnership. She was trying to work her way out of it, and we were trying to support her in moving her way out of it for various means. But I think it sort of her scores very much reflected sort of realities of fluctuations in her ongoing trauma and her everyday life. And so this is a bit of the analysis that takes a lot more time, but we have started to take a look at some of these interviews and also the interview reports, the reports from the facilitators, and women really talked about the way in which that people begin to recognize purpose in their life. And this quote here around the women telling her that she is resilient and powerful sort of speaks to that connection and the collective recognition. That is a big, powerful piece. The women talked a lot about how their friendships gave them, that they developed in this intervention, gave them the ability to experience joy and to come to a space and laugh with women and think about their future, valuing their friendships. Again, this is from an interview excerpt with a woman from Brandfontein site, which is the Cameron Center, and thinking about looking back where you're coming from, but then reimagining yourself. I can see I'm still standing, I'm still strong. It's helped me, it's improved me, so it's repositioning myself. And a big part of visioning the future for these women was about realizing that they have to think about themselves also in important ways and support their own future. So in addition to sort of this devotion to their children, they feel like they now have an opportunity or space to think about how they can promote their own dreams and their own well-being and what that might look like. So in thinking about pathways to sort of success here, it very much feeds into sort of my understanding and interpretation of the concepts around social defeat and how we are able to move from a perception of giving up, or feeling that we have very low levels of autonomy, and an externalization of all success. So a lot of women in the early sessions talk to me, what are your skills? Where do you get your strength from? And they all say, God. God, and I grew up in a Catholic household. I heard my mother say that a lot. This comes from God. And a real opportunity for them to think, okay, well, in addition to God, how are you fitting into this picture, and how are you contributing to and expanding into this? And so that coping mechanisms of drawing on God can also be one that limits the ability to see your own strengths, because it helps you in a coping strategy to deal with things you can't manage that feel bigger than you. And that's something that I've seen in my work in Colombia, and also in other older projects in but it also then can simultaneously limit your action and readiness for action, because you then are waiting for God to enable you to act. So what sort of happens is in this space is they are able to start to re-internalize the good things, so they can externalize the bad things that they can't change. And like them talk about saying, I'll leave to God what is God's, and then I will take on what I can do and what is mine. And sort of preparing, starting to see that as a way to prepare for types of that build readiness for action and change. So moving, a lot of women talking about having hope in their interviews and seeing a plan where something can be action. I think for the plus sessions, it sort of acts as this nice protective container. Nancy Fraser would talk about this as a counter-public sphere, where sort of marginalized groups who are often excluded in society can be protected to find their own voice, to think about what matters to them before they go out into the big bad world where they imagine or experience oppression, and the way in which their histories of engaging in the world has sort of changed the way they think about it. So really operating on some of these mechanisms around hopelessness and defeat, in the face of what seems like quite insurmountable collective challenges. So we sort of we did find that courage plus successfully reduced symptoms of depression in the sample of women, had an impact on their empowerment and their readiness for change, and also had some impact on for some women, their economic circumstances. So through these increased feelings of empowerment, about 7 or 8 women sort of talked about how they went out to find new work because they felt positive like they could, and so they took chances that they hadn't taken before. And so in thinking about what's next and how we might move on from there, we know that collective narrative therapy as a model can be very helpful in reducing depression significantly in context of some ongoing structural violence, and that plus sessions, or this opportunity to think and plan and make connections, put plans into action, is something that could feasibly be added to this intervention and have an additional impact. We were involved with the social work team in Africa Tikkun, so each site we had either an auxiliary social worker or the social worker participating in the session, and they were trained on the delivery of the intervention at the same level as on main facilitators from COURRAGE. And this means that we could sort of move this to potentially other settings outside of NGO space. So could this be done in a primary healthcare setting or a district hospital, where you might have auxiliary social workers or social worker staff on hand? And it made me think back to sort of a big piece of my work in my PhD, where I sort of mapped these revolving doors of women through mental health services, because in the worlds where they lived, the big drivers of their depression, such as their poverty or violence in their relationships, never shifted. So they would just continue to go through and through, because all of the other pathways to provide social interventions were blocked either by stigma or sort of funding constraints. And I really think that an intervention like this, delivered at a district hospital in Manguzi, where I was, would have had huge impact on the lives of this women in a very rural place where they felt quite helpless. And so again, some of the interviews suggest that there was huge impact on empowerment and also on poverty. So in sort of future studies, you might want to start to look at additional aspects of our evaluation look specifically at poverty measures and empowerment measures. As problematic as some empowerment measures might be, I think it's maybe trying to make it better. And then I say the last one with trepidation and fear because I'm terrified of the idea of trials. But I think that this sort of suggests that there might be some value in doing one, and particularly trying to figure out if I could survive doing a pragmatic trial. But I suppose it remains to be seen. So I'll just finish off with one of my favorite quotes that sits in my office. Audre Lorde, for those who are not familiar with her, she was a radical feminist theorist and activist in the United States in the 70s and 80s. And in one of her books, she says that without community, there is no liberation. And I think very much what we saw in this intervention was women creating a new community of practice and creating a collective to support themselves through a process of change and a real sort of a movement from sadness to joy and to hope. And I think that that has been sort of my biggest pleasure in terms of being involved with this type of work over the past 10 years. And just a chance to thank some of the partners who have been involved in this study. It was a very small amount of money that we received to do this pilot, and so it was the work of huge contributions from people who really just believed in what we were trying to do in terms of contributing time or additional resources. So at UCL, myself and my research assistant Nicholas, who did all those amazing drafts that we saw and talked me through and reminded me that I once upon a time as a psychologist learned how to do stats, and it's all there in my brain. And a very close partnership with the SHM Foundation and specifically their EMBER team, which focuses on supporting grassroots innovation in global mental health. And local artist in Johannesburg named Alia, who did this amazing sort of theory of change that is the background of this slide. And at the University of Johannesburg, my amazing collaborator is Professor Shahar Masoul, who's a professor in social work, and research assistant Patricia, who did a lot of the interviews. On the implementation side, of course, we had the COLA team, and Marcelo Nino, who is the founder of COLA and the creator of the COURRAGE methodology, and Kanye Nana, who were the main formal facilitators who implemented the intervention. And then through Africa Tiku, we have the amazing contributions from Tombi, who focuses on developing sort of interventions for women and children across their sites, and also their amazing social work and auxiliary social worker teams at all four sites. The project was funded by the Mackey Fund at the Institute for Global Health, and we had amazing in-kind contributions from SEDA to the SA Federation for Mental Health, came to be trained in Cameroon. So thank you very much, and I'd love to hear questions or advice on sort of what you think is next for this amazing piece of work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Really fascinating, inspiring work. To questions.
Thank you very much. I think that intervention is amazing. The fact that it's in the community for me is really important.
Yeah.
We keep talking about decanting our healthcare facilities to make it more accessible to the population. So I'm interested in what were the retention rates in the interventions. Is it all complete? That kind of yes.
So the reality is that there were two dropouts that happened very early on after the first session. But the reason that our sample was a bit restricted was that there were 5 women from one of the sites who all had specialist appointments with their children on the day that we did the final THQ9. So they didn't drop out, they just couldn't be there for the last session. They were at graduation, they were at the party before.
Just missing data.
So they just missing data more than, yeah. There are 2 dropouts and they happened very early on.
They all completed all of the sessions. It's amazing.
I think there were 1 or 2 missing, because there were 2 people who missed sessions, but again, there's one woman whose son had passed, and then so they were around sort of 11. happens to all of us, and so then we don't get to show. But they came back, and they came back because they loved it. And I got to go to meet, well, I met all the women at the graduation, but in December I also went to see women at Alex and Orange Farm sites during their sessions where they had training, and just to sort of meet with them and talk to them about what they felt the interventions meant to them was amazing. It was just amazing. They loved it, so they kept coming. But I guess in a way it was described as therapy. It doesn't feel like therapy. It doesn't feel like therapy. It feels like them as a space where they get to go and do something that's joyful and laugh with women like them and create these amazing books. I wish I had. They took them, so they're theirs. I don't get to bring them around with me, but they are really amazing, powerful stuff. Yes.
I suppose the two questions that came to mind for me, this was amazing, really amazing journey that you had. First is that they really have primary identity of disabled children.
Yes.
And it's quite profound that even with all the input they had, there was still such high level of depression. So that's quite significant for me. And it feels like that's actually skewed the results a little because so much of attention is on children. And perhaps not enough attention. So it's a cohort that their identity is numbers of disabled children, children's intellectual disabilities. So that's the first thing. The second thing that feels very interesting to me is how one replicates that, where one sends people from the community with the identity of being depressed.
Yes.
They know the stigma of depression, stigma on mental health. So it feels like they had an easy way in because they weren't stigmatized as depressed. It just so happened you measure depression, you measured anxiety.
Yes, yeah.
So it feels quite profound. I don't know how easy it is to set up a group without all the support that group already had as an identity. They might not have an identity as themselves, but they have an identity as mothers of disabled children.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So in one of the groups, Orange Farm, some of the women were from a pre-existing group, some of them weren't. So they sort of created a new group sort of identity for themselves. And in that group, there were a couple of women who themselves had disability. So that's intellectual disability. And, we try to sort of track whether there were effects in the groups from knowing people and sort of knowing each other from before and sort of coming in and not knowing anybody at all. And I think it's still something that we're thinking through. But with the women in one of the groups, they were all the same women. So they were all from the original Mothers of Children with Disabilities group. And their scores were no different to the others. But it's really hard to do those comparisons with such small numbers, so I feel like I sort of lose the ability to say things for sure. But your second point around what might this look like if you brought people from the community who all had depression to create a new wellness. It makes me think of sort of the very first time I tried to do something like this was linked to crime study and Inga's site in Northwest, and where they had group problem solving therapy, and we were sort of looking at could we sort of do something that's a little bit more collective, and in the cohort site, not the trial site, we added some similar stories around working collectively to solve a problem, and there was something about the I think the problem solving therapy approach does not give you enough time to develop a collective identity because you're focusing on all these different things. And so the women from the evaluations of that I spoke to didn't talk about building bonds together. They sort of talked about, liking each other and they had a nice time, but they didn't talk about becoming one, as it were. And they didn't choose to do anything collectively, they chose to do stuff independently. and the collective then moved to their families or to their churches, which are the parts of their identity that make more sense to them or have more meaning than their depression identity. And so one of the things I would love to do is see if an intervention like this creates that sort of collective sense of engagement and self between people who the only thing they have in common is their depression. Because I think that sort of seems to be that gap in trying to get that sort of grassroots mobilization around rights and resources for mental health, is that you need people to sort of feel like they're a part of a movement. And I think that sort of a collective, an intervention like this that's focused more on building a collective community could potentially do that. So that might be another the type of setting actually that would be good to look at it in.
For me, it raises a really interesting question about how you identify people in communities. Is it around the depression, or is it around like a shared identity here with being mothers or children, or do you find other ways of getting people to come together? And mental health is almost a side thing, you know, but actually that collective identity is what builds cohesion in the group.
Because in Colombia, that's what we did. We worked in Colombia. We did a participatory intervention with people who were internally displaced by conflict, and that identity is something that's very contentious in society. So there's no value to that identity, and so they sort of use it to access services. So in a similar way, it's stigmatized to sort of having a mental health diagnosis. And we brought them together for participatory workshops and measured THQ9 as well to see if the participatory approach would have a knock-on effect on it. But it wasn't a mental health intervention, but it was a social intervention where people talked about their distress and created their own definition of mental distress and well-being. And then we said, okay, in light of this, what would you do? And they came up with their own self-directed projects and supported it. So participatory action cycles, essentially. And similar reductions in THQ9, but dropouts were much bigger. So we can't, because displacement is a completely different phenomenon to try and work with. So we had not good stats, but really good interviews and really good sort of voice evaluation of that. So, but it was a population that came together for a reason that didn't have to do with mental health, but saw the reduction in mental health as a population that is a very high risk in Colombia for having high levels of PTSD and depression.
To what extent did you call it a therapy, or to what extent was that not an issue? I mean, because thinking in a way about not calling it a therapy group, reduce the stigma around it. I'm just interested in, I mean, thinking about the idea of putting it into a primary healthcare clinic, to what extent might it keep it very much as a therapy and potentially stigmatized location?
Yeah, so it was presented to women in sort of briefing sessions as a therapeutic intervention. So that's how it was presented to them in terms of them signing it. We had way more women want to do it than we were able to include. So we had a cap of 50 women, and we didn't have any barriers to entry around symptoms. It was just if you were using services at if you could and you wanted to join and sign up. And I think at the Deep Sleep site alone, there were 50 women who signed up. And I mean, it could be a barrier to entry if you put it in the primary care setting and call it therapy. Which then, what could we call it instead? Like storytelling interventions or.
Why call it an intervention? Rather call it coming together. I don't know. To think of something else that really embodies that movement. So movement, or because empowerment became such an important.
because in that sense, I sort of wonder, when you take that out of it, will you then have like mixed groups of people with sort of lots of different identities? So you might have people with a mental health condition who get referred to it, or you might have somebody with physical disability who gets referred to it, and you just sort of come together and figure things out. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
You spoke about the kind of natural dissemination in the previous one, in the case of in Northwest, I think, where it's sort of when people took that idea of the collective identity and took it to the church or the family.
Yeah.
And I you say in this one, they had a much stronger sort of group identity. But it sounds like it's something they could teach people in their lives. Did they speak about that, taking them to other spaces in their life? Or?
So in terms of the specific training around sort of savings groups, a lot of women talked about moving it outwards to other spheres in their lives. And that was sort of the first time where we sort of thought about, you put the tenor changed in that meeting. We sort of had these women who sort of loved each other and had all these positive feelings towards each other. And they started talking about money in the savings group, and they were like, I don't know, but I can go and do it with my family, I can go and do it with my church. And they had a lot of trepidation around that. So I think there is still something about trust, and what are the lines where you will trust people with certain things and not with others. Some of the women have shown an interest in wanting to run their own courage groups with other people in the community, the Alex sites in particular. Their collective project is this: they want to start their own NGO. So they've been getting support and training and registering organizations and those types of things. And they now run their own meetings with their own agendas, and they've sort of really taken the structure of courage and implemented it for their own purposes to keep meeting up in Africa to unless they need the space, or they have the space and computers. So it's something that has really benefited from the community types of networks that are built together.
Questions? I just have one other question about the plus component.
Yeah.
And how did you come to design that, and what made you think of adding that? And also, was there anything in the narratives which women described about what was the added value of that component?
So the plus session sort of, the idea for that came from, I guess, the other part of my head that does community development, international development types of work, and thinking about the need to sort of bridge psychological with the structural. If the structural is the thing that keeps coming up in people's narratives of their distress. So in Colombia, in our project, one of the partnerships that we linked the participatory groups to was sort of the entrepreneurship department at Department University, and they came in and trained them on the Canva model, which is sort of a model used in businesses to plan action and strategy, and it's a very sort of straightforward. It can be used with people across sort of levels of literacy, the modification of it, and people enjoyed it a lot in Colombia, so we thought that would be a nice tangible thing that women could do to plan and to strategize, because the balance is that you could have a much longer sort of piece around entrepreneurship or income generation, but that becomes less feasible if you're moving it to spaces like primary care centers. So it was trying to balance what we do in a shorter period of time with sort of a general skill level that could still be useful in helping people think through the practice some of those skills. And so that was sort of the decision behind what went into the plus, and keeping the storytelling aspect from the problem-solving therapy approach that we tried in Clark's work, and then working with women in each site to rewrite the story so it made sense for women in Alex and women in Brackington. So the stories were themselves different, but told a story of women who had similar backgrounds to them doing something different, sort of acting, moving towards action. And so they talked about, gosh, it's amazing that she was able to do that. Intervention. Well, do you think you use something like that? Those sort of like pros. I'm not sure how women have talked specifically about plus yet. So I've not gone through all the interviews, but in the couple that I've read, had the chance to read through, this just finished in December. So we just got the transcripts back. The interviews. The day I got on the plane. So from the interviews I have had the chance to read, in terms of the plus, they liked this. They said they liked the stories. They liked to be able to hear about a woman doing something about it, and they also liked putting it in, like, giving something a try. They liked that they could give it a try, practice this new self. You know, imagine. And at the graduation was a big thing, saying this is the beginning of the next bit of your life. So lots of forward thinking. There's one more question.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Quick question. In what languages was the material presented? And was there a classroom to support participation in the
So the languages that the intervention was delivered in, the manuals themselves were in English, but the facilitators spoke Zulu and Xhosa, and the women spoke Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, and sort of there was this interesting thing where they all translated for each other. Correct. Engagement. And in terms of stipends, so the interventions were held on days when they were already going to be at the center. So we planned in order to reduce any additional sort of costs for women. So, and women were there for 3 hours or more, but in the particular structure they were fed through that sort of program. So they came there on those days anyway, they were given a meal, and I think there was transportation was covered for one center, like deep sleep, Melbourne were furthest away. But in the other centers, women could walk and did walk.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Thank you. Any further questions? No, we can speak to Rochelle. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. And Rochelle, thank you so much.
Thank you.